Hello and welcome to the Canon RF-mount Complete Lens Guide. My name is John Gringo and I have a fantastic class in store for you. This is going to be a complete education on lenses with a hyper focus on the Canon RF-mount lenses. There's lots to talk about in here and I'm very excited about this because lenses are one of my favorite aspects about photography. I think that you can tell a lot more about a photographer by knowing what lenses they like to shoot than what camera they shoot with. For most photographers, their main investment is in lenses. They might have a camera, maybe two, maybe even three in some cases, but they're probably going to have three or more lenses, and that's where their greatest investment is going to be. And it's the ones that don't get replaced every couple years like some of the cameras do. Many people will keep lenses for a decade or more. My oldest lens that is in my active use category is more than 30 years old. And so making a smart buying decision and then knowing how to use those lenses is really, really important to photographers. Now, Canon has been around for a very long time, and they have been one of the industry leaders in making lenses. So they've got a long history and they make a lot of different lenses. So it gives us a lot to talk about in this particular class, which is what's making me so excited about this, is that we've got a lot of good material ahead of us. Now, the idea about modern cameras and interchangeable lenses and the different ecosystems that are available out there is that the manufacturers are going to make a whole bunch of lenses, and you're going to look for the ones that fit your particular needs. You don't need all the lenses, although it might be nice to have access to all of them. You really only need a handful of them that fit your particular needs. Now, what those needs are varies from person to person, and it's going to depend on what your subject is, what it is you're photographing. Are you photographing birds in flight, people, buildings? What are your particular goals? What are you doing with your photographs? And finally, what type of style do you like to shoot in? And everyone is going to have a slightly different combination of these three factors, and it's going to lead pretty much everyone to have a slightly different set of lenses, which I think is one of the fun aspects. You could have 100 photographers together, have them all open up their camera bag, and chances are every one of those 100 people would have a slightly different collection of lenses that they like to use. This is something that you can really personalize to the way that you want to work. So what this class is going to be doing is we're going to be doing, as I say, a complete education on lenses. We're going to be talking a little bit about some of the basics about what lenses can do. We're going to be showing you how you can solve certain types of photographic problems with lenses. And we're going to be really educating you on what lenses you need, maybe what lenses you want as well, and how to use them and how to get the most out of them. And of course, we're talking about Canon lenses here. So we're going to be talking about Canon technology, Canon features in particular, and how they match up to the cameras. And so if you use the Canon RF lens mount system, this is a class that's really going to help you out in the long term. Now, this class is not at least one thing. It is not a traditional lens review. So if you want to compare a Nikon 85mm to a Canon 85mm lens and how they compare in chromatic aberration in the bottom left-hand corner at f/22, I'm not going to be doing that in here. There are plenty of places that take individual lenses, they test their sharpness and compare them to other models of other brands. And that's fine and it's useful in some cases, but it's not what we're doing in here. My general opinion is that from top to bottom in the Canon RF lens mount line, you have great quality lenses. You could take the bottom of the line lens, and something's got to be at the bottom. You could take the bottom of the line Canon camera, hand those to a professional photographer, and they can go out and shoot a cover story for the National Geographic or any magazine or for any commercial publication you want. That's how good the lenses are these days. It's not, well, only these can be used for professional purposes and all these others are just really not that good. That is not the case. They are all of extremely high quality. That is not to say that there is a difference from the bottom to top. There are some lenses that are better quality, but the fact of the matter is that the bottom of the market has come up so far in the last several decades that you could use anything to achieve professional results. And so if you want to get great results, you can choose any lens you want. It depends on, once again, your style and what subject you're shooting and what your goals are in that particular shot. So we're not going to be doing your traditional lens review in here. This is more of an education, and that's what we're going to focus on in here. And as I've said before, Canon's got a lot of lenses, and they've got a lot of history, and they are one of the leaders in the industries of producing great quality lenses, a wide variety of lenses. And so we've got a lot to sink our teeth in here. We've got a lot that we're going to be talking about. In fact, let me give you a quick thumbnail of all the different sections that we have in here. I've broken this down. I like to stay very organized and clean about what we're talking about. And so we're going to talk at start about some basic things, and we're going to get into some Canon particular technology. We're going to go through a rundown of each individual lens that is available. We'll be doing some comparisons. We're going to look at some older EF-mount lenses, and we're also going to look at aftermarket lenses as well as accessories. And then I'll tie it all up in the end with giving you some recommendations of how to kind of go about choosing particular lenses and creating a set of lenses that work well for what you're going to do. And so we'll talk about different genres of photography and the best lenses for them. Now, as part of this video series course, I do have a couple of printout items that you'll want to know about and have that are part of the full version of this class. The first is the class notes, and this is a rather thick document. It's one of the thickest I've put together so far. And so this has a lot of the graphics from the class. It has a lot of the main bullet point pieces of information that I'm going to have on screen, so you don't need to copy every one of those down if you like to take notes. A lot of it's going to be printed here. I'm a very visual instructor, so I like to include a lot of the visuals in here, and so sometimes there's graphs and tables in here which will be exactly as what you see on screen here. In some cases, there's some additional information in the PDF that is not in the class itself. It's just easier to present in that particular formula. Now, the other thing that I have, and this one's a little nerdy, this is the lens data sheets. And when I put this class together, and just for personal interest and professional knowledge, I need to know certain things about lenses. And I go to Canon's website. Canon's got pretty good specifications about different lenses, but I find that it's inconsistent from lens to lens. I want to know what's the minimum aperture on this lens. You told me on the other lens, but it's not on this lens. And so then I'd have to go to Canon, one of the European agencies or one of the Asian agencies to find the specifications there, or a retailer. And none of them list everything that should be listed in there. And so I decided to put together my own list. And so this has a listing of all the lenses that are available and all the specifications that I think any photographer might want to know, including some ones that are not normally listed, like is it an internal zoom or does it have an extending front barrel? What year was the lens introduced? As well as all those other standard specifications that you would have. So both of these documents are available when you have the full purchase of the full course. And so they're just a PDF that is listed along with the other videos. And so look for it right along, either at the top or the bottom of the list of the other videos that you can download for this class. And these will be very helpful in getting you the information that is in this class. All right, so let's talk about lenses. Canon has a ton of very, very different lenses in many cases. Now, usually these lenses are chosen and designed by lens engineers or product managers trying to address a certain marketplace. They need a particular lens to fill a particular niche, and they design a lens that fits that in a particular budget. But this is just a starting point for photographers. Okay, fine, you have a lens that's designed for wildlife. What if I want to use it for an unusual portrait situation? Well, that's perfectly acceptable, and that's one of the great things about photography, is that it is very versatile, and the lenses and the ability to change lenses is one of the things that makes photography so versatile about what it can do. Now, in this class, we'll be talking a lot about the primary characteristics of a lens, which is what lens mounts it in. That's one of the first things you want to know as to whether you can use it on your camera or not. And we've kind of narrowed that one down already into the RF lens mount. We're going to be talking about angle of view. We're going to spend a whole section on that one. We'll be talking about the maximum aperture quite a bit. Tell me those three things about a lens, and I'll probably be able to tell you quite a bit about what that lens is, what it's capable of, and who it's targeted to. But there's a lot of other things going on with lenses as well, kind of secondary characteristics. And I know it seems strange to throw image quality into a secondary characteristic, but that's how good lenses have gotten these days. And so there's a lot of other features that we'll be talking about when it comes to these other characteristics that you want to look at and be aware of when choosing a particular lens. Of course, we have the two major categories of lenses, prime lenses and zoom lenses. We'll be talking about each of these and which ones are best for various types of activities as we go throughout this class. And so that'll be a big topic that we come back to again and again. Now, to learn more about your lenses, you can just start by looking at the lenses. What does it say on the lens? What information does it provide to you? Because when they put something printed on a lens, it's gone through a lot of checks to make sure that that's a pretty important thing that you need to know about how that lens particularly works. And so there'll be some specifications, there'll be some feature identification so you know what one thing is in particular. We're going to go through all of that in this class. And so you'll have a complete understanding for any lens that you currently have or that you might have on how it's going to work. Now, the traditional way that Canon lists information about a lens is, they have the lens mount, then the focal length information, maximum aperture, and then some other additional information. And because of the format that we're working in, I needed to reorganize this so things fit a little bit more tightly up on screen. And so we're going with a little bit more vertical format. And so I'm going to include the same information, but just over these 4 lines, generally speaking, rather than spread out on one particular line. So that's just a way that I've had to address things in this class. Now, I think it's good to know a little bit about Canon if you're going to be using Canon cameras and lenses. And so I want to talk a little bit about Canon here in this introduction section. First off, Canon is a very, very large, diverse company. They did start with photography as their main focus, but they have branched out into other industrial divisions that we're not going to get into, but I just want to acknowledge the fact that the imaging division is just one division within Canon. It is from my understanding, it's a pretty profitable division, and they do quite well there, but they also use and lend that technology to other devices that is used in the industry. And so let's talk a little bit about Canon history. I'm not going to dive too far into the weeds on this one, but when you're heavily invested with a company, it's good to know a little bit about how that company came about and a little bit about their history. So they started back in 1933. It was kind of just a small group of guys that were inspired by Leica cameras. And they disassembled a Leica camera and they thought, wow, this is just basic parts put together. And when it gets put together as a camera, it's really expensive. And they wanted to have a more affordable camera. So the whole goal of early Canon cameras was an affordable camera that regular people could afford, not something that was too fancy and too expensive. And so it took them a little while to finally put together, a prototype and then some actual working models that they could start selling. And they made an early rangefinder camera in 1936. Now, at this time, they didn't make lenses. That was not within their wheelhouse of expertise. They made simple little cameras and they needed lenses, and so they used the best lenses that were available from Japan, and those were Nikon lenses. And I know that sounds kind of ironic nowadays because of the rivalry between the two companies, but yes, Canon cameras used Nikon lenses before Canon figured out how to make lenses themselves. But this is something that they rectified pretty quickly. They realized that they needed to make their own lenses, and so 1946, a decade later, they started making their own lenses. Now, this is in an S series. This is a screw mount series, and lenses back in that time, rather than the bayonet mount that we're used to, would screw on like a screw onto a nut. And it would take a little bit of a time to screw it in, but it was universal. It was kind of nice because you could exchange one brand of lenses with another brand of cameras. And so there was this universal mount that still exists today. There are still screw mount products that can be found that you can adapt to various devices. And that was the way that the rangefinder system worked at the time. But the rangefinder, they saw as a limited production item as far as how far it could go. And they thought that they would have much better futuristic plans with a single lens reflex. That was the new thing to have in photography. And so after World War II, they put together a first single lens reflex camera, the Canon Flex. And this used a new bayonet mount called the R mount. And so this made mounting lenses a lot easier. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details of the different mounts here. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the technology section. But just a few of the other highlights. In 1971, they came out with their first professional SLR. Up to this point, it'd been kind of standard consumer-grade products, and they decided they wanted to go to the pro market. The main rival, of course, was Nikon, and they had come out with a pretty high-end camera in 1959, and I think Canon really wanted to compete for that professional market. So they came out with the F1, and the FD lens mount is actually very similar to the R mount. They've been making changes. Both Canon and Nikon during this phase were making small changes, evolutionary changes to their lens mount. They decided to add a little knob or a pin that would do a certain thing, and that would adapt it for the next several years, and then they would make another adjustment. Now, in 1976, they came out with the AE1. This is not top-of-the-line professional camera. This is kind of straight average consumer camera. But man, was it popular. Hugely popular. This was heavily advertised. There was a bit of a photography boom in the 70s because this is something where everybody could really afford to get into a camera and make pretty good images. And this was the most popular camera in the 70s for most enthusiast photographers. And so it really propelled Canon in many ways and really set their name as far as one of the primary camera manufacturers. Now, there was limitations to the manual focus lenses that they had been using, and they had been eyeing some changes. And so in 1987, they changed to the EOS electronic focus system. That's the EF lens mount. We'll talk more about this as we get into the technology sections and the EF lens sections as well. And they maintained this EF mount as they went into digital in the year 2000 with the D30. They had been kind of playing around with it with Kodak and some different models, but this was their first, true to the heart Canon product that was digital. But they kept the same lens mount going forward. But once again, the lens mount saw that it was limited in what it can do going down the road. And the next stage was mirrorless. And that is where the RF mount comes into play. And so that came about in 2018. And the day it came out, I knew that I would be making this class, but I didn't know how long I was going to have to wait, because when they first introduced it, there was only a handful of lenses, and there's not really enough to talk about until they have a good collection. And so I have been patiently waiting. Strike that. I have been impatiently waiting to bring this class forward. And so it's very good to finally be here. Now, we're going to kind of go back real quickly and go through this series of lenses. And so their first development of lenses was in the screw mount lenses for their rangefinder camera. And they made some pretty impressive lenses back in the time. Look at that, a 50-0.95. That's the fastest lens they've ever made. It may not have been the sharpest lens you've ever seen, but they did it. And a lot of these lenses were the very first of that particular style. It was very difficult to make long telephoto lenses. It was difficult to make wide lenses. And so a 19 millimeter one was exotic, extremely unusually wide at the time. And nowadays, that's a pretty common lens. When they went to their R mount, this is their SLR mount, they needed to come out with a lot of lenses fairly quickly. So they took a lot of the rangefinder designs, they adapted them to a bayonet mount for the R mount and adapted them here. They also pushed forward and started making new and exciting lenses, a 300 millimeter lens or a 2000 millimeter lens. How about a 58 f1.2? They've been making fast lenses for a long time. This is a part of their DNA, part of their history. Now, they made some small iterations to the lens mount, and it became the FL mount. And they continued to push the boundaries of what they could do with these particular lenses. Now, the original R mount, well, the S mount, let's go back to the S mount. Why is it called the S mount? Well, it was a screw mount, so that's where the S comes from. What about the R mount? Well, it was for a reflex camera, and I haven't found direct documentation, but it would make sense that the R lenses were for the reflex camera. Now, the FL is not so clear. There's some indication that it might have been for the FL in reflex, in a reflex mirror. Just some more letters that are also included in the technology jargon. Or it might be for the fact that they started using fluorite elements in a number of their lenses. And this was really some exciting new technology that they were adding to their lenses. And so they started calling, even though they didn't have fluorite in all of their lenses, they started calling them FL lenses, and that's where the FL mount, I think, came from. And then came the FD mount, which is once again a small change, and there's a number of compatibility issues going back and forth between the R and the FL and the FD, and we're not going to get into the particulars here because this is not a class on those lenses. But there is some forward and backward compatibility and some incompatibility as well, depending on the specific products that you're talking about. And so FD, Canon's not real clear as to what that meant. It might have meant full diaphragm because it would allow you to look through the lens and compose in full diaphragm and have it automatically stop down when you need it. But here we can see a lot of the lenses that we have today, or at least the genesis of them. The 55 1.2, well, we have a 50 1.2 now. The 35 to 70, 2.8 to 3.5, well, now it's a greater range and it stays at 2.8 the whole time. The 85 1.2, well, yes, we still have an 85 1.2 these days. The 600 4.5 has become a 600 f4. And so a lot of these optical designs have quite a bit of history in them. And then the next lens mount was called the new FD mount, and they made some minor changes there, but they were coming out with more and more really high-end professional lenses. They started really perfecting their wide-angle capability. The 24 to 35, well, that's just a predecessor to the 20 to 35, which became the 17 to 35, which is now the 15 to 35. They've just expanded their capabilities all along the way. Now, the FD mount had limitations. There was mechanical limitations that they wanted to move to an electronic connection where they wouldn't need to keep putting Band-Aids on this mechanical connection. And then there is the mount opening on the lens itself. It was only 42 millimeters in size, which made for a nice small camera, but if they had a larger size, that would free up the optical engineers to make better quality lenses. So in 1987, they introduced the EOS system with the electronic focusing system, the EF mount. And so this gave them an electrical connection and a large lens mount. And this helped them achieve some of their goals. They wanted to achieve extremely fast lenses that could autofocus. So a 50 millimeter 1.0 was one of the hallmark lenses when this system was introduced. And this whole system was not going to be viable, they thought, unless they could develop a 300-2.8, which could focus quickly and capture sports photography. That is the minimum standard that they had for this EOS system. And so a 300-2.8 was one of the first lenses they brought out to showcase that you could capture sports with autofocus at the time, which was revolutionary. There was a lot of very skilled sports photographers that could manually track focus, but wow, autofocus took it to another level. So they introduced their EOS system. It started with the EOS 650 and a handful of lenses that were anywhere from practical to exotic. They came out with a number of interesting new lenses that we had not seen before and some practical, affordable ones so everybody could get into the system. Now, you'll notice that I'm putting the dates 1987, which was the introduction date, to 2020. Well, technically, they're still selling this well after 2020, but 2020 was the last year that they came out with either a new camera or a new lens for the EF system. Now, they could prove me wrong somewhere down the road, but I think those are the dates that we're probably going to cement in the history books for the range of the EF mount EOS system. Now, they're keeping the EOS going, which is the electro-optical system. Now, originally, just kind of fun fact here, is that it was originally the entirely organic system, and they decided to change which words it made up the EOS. And so that's what it was before it became, went to the marketing department, most probably. So this EF mount was hugely popular for roughly about 30 years. They made high-quality cameras, high-quality lenses, a great diversity of products, and so this is what became the leading photographic choice of tools for photographers. Canon cameras and Canon lenses is what most professionals shot starting about, I would say, it started changing around 1990 when their autofocus system really started taking off. It had close competition with Nikon. It was a close battle, but generally speaking, Canon outsold Nikon during all of those years. But as we got deeper and deeper into the SLR phase, and then the advent of some mirrorless cameras from Olympus and Panasonic and Fuji and a few other manufacturers, started showing the limitations of the SLR system. Now, the big problem with the SLR system is the mirror in the camera. So this is what reflects light upwards so that you can see through the lens. It was a great innovation back in its time, decades ago, but now it was the problem. And the problem was limited data about what the lens is pointed at. Now, the cameras did have a light meter that received a little bit of information from light that was coming through, but it was extremely limited in what it could do. Even in the best of the Canon cameras, it was only helping out a very, very small amount. And so having this high resolution sensor hiding behind the mirror, it wasn't helping you out before the shot. Yes, its main purpose is to record the shot, but can also be used for analyzing data about what's going on in front of the lens. The other problem was the flange distance. The mirror had to be in there and it had to flip up and down, and so there was mechanics in there, and it caused the sensor to be a particular distance away from the lens mount, and this limited the optical engineers from some of the designs that they might want to use in a particular lens. And by shortening that distance, it's really opened up a number of new opportunities. So they introduced the RF lens mount in September of 2018 with the EOS R, their inaugural camera, a handful of lenses that were once again practical as well as maybe inspiring, a few new items in there that they hadn't done before, at least in the 28 to 70 f2. No one had ever done that before. And so in their change from the EF mount to the RF mount, they decided that the mount size was big enough. And so they decided to keep exactly the same mount size. That was not a limiting factor. But the flange distance, the distance from the mount to the sensor, was holding them back. And so they brought that forward quite a bit from 44 millimeters to 20 millimeters. And that's one reason, there's several reasons, but that's one reason why you can't just take EF mount lenses and mount them on an RF mount camera. They don't focus in the right place. There's an adapter that you can use to where they can work, but I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit. So we'll talk about that in due course. So with the RF mount, we've got even higher quality imagery that we can get with this because the optical engineers can pursue even better quality routes of getting light directed in onto the sensor. We're going to have better performance. We've got a new faster 12-pin communication, so there's a little bit more that can be going on between the body and the lens. It's still a relatively compact design, and it can still work with all of the EF lenses with that basic adapter that I've talked about. And so that's how the RF mount has really come into being. Now there is a slight diversion on the RF mount, and that is the RF-S system. And so this is a cropped frame system of cameras and lenses that both use the RF mount. It's just that they're designed for the smaller size sensor. So we have an RF mount camera, for instance, and it's going to have an RF mount on it, and it's going to use RF lenses. And now we have RF-S lenses that will work on a camera with the smaller size sensor, but also carries the RF mount on it. Now that RF mount camera that has the smaller sensor can also use all the regular RF lenses. So you can use all of them because they produce a very large image circle. But you cannot use the RF-S lenses on the standard full frame cameras. And so we'll talk more about this as we get into the class a little bit more in particular about some of the lenses. So the full frame sensor, which is the same size as 35 millimeter film, has proven to be very popular. There's nothing that's perfect about it. It's just kind of a happy medium of the right size sensor that gets you great image quality while still having a product that's fairly portable and versatile in what it can do. The crop frame sensor is nice for some people because it is a little bit less money to produce. It's smaller in size. It can make for slightly smaller cameras and lenses, a little bit more portable design. It's not nearly as popular as the full frame in the number of products that they make for it. It's more of a small token number of products that they make to help people get into the Canon system. And I think Canon's hoping that they migrate up to the full frame system when they really want to get into it. Now, there is a crop factor of 1.6 on this smaller crop frame sensor. So when you're trying to compare lenses, they magnify lenses by a factor of 1.6 times when it comes to the focal length. And this is something that we'll talk more about when we get into the focal lengths and angles of view of the various different lenses that are available. Now, Canon makes a lot of different products in their imaging division, and the cinema portion of it is a growing portion. And shooting movies is similar, but in some ways very different than shooting still photos. But you can do both with pretty much all the Canon modern cameras these days. And so you can shoot stills and then flip a switch and you're shooting movies. But it's not designed as a movie camera. And if you start to shoot more and more serious cinematography, you start seeing the shortcomings in the standard still camera when you want to use it for shooting movies. And so Canon's addressed this in a number of ways. They've taken the still camera and they put on some different modifications, changed the software in the menu, and voila, you get a cine-focused still camera. That's very good at shooting stills, but has some special features designed for the cine mode. They make camcorders, usually with fixed lenses, which are specifically designed for shooting video. You might be able to shoot a still photo with them, but that's not what anyone uses them for in the real world. And then they have really, truly dedicated cinema cameras that have interchangeable mounts, and they have interchangeable cinema lenses that use the RF mount. There's some that use the EF mount and even other mounts. And that's not what we're going to be talking about in this class, other than at this very moment. There are RF lenses that do cinema work. We're going to be focused on the still lenses in here. It's interesting to note the differences between a still focused lens, one that's got a little bit of video to it, like the 51.4, and then we have ones that are truly dedicated to cinema work, like the 50 f1.3. Now, as I say, Canon makes a whole collection of different cinema lenses that are specifically designed for capturing video. And these are lenses that meet different standards. They have different features. They're designed differently because they have a different demand. So let's look at some of the differences between lenses that appear similar in their outward naming. The 51.2 LUSM lens, which is a great still photography lens, and the 50T 1.3 LF lens. First off, the stills photographer is usually independently owned and operated. And that kind of changes the way it's used versus a rental property or crew operated, about where the markings are on the lens, how much can be afforded, what is the quality of the lens. And so there's a number of issues in there. Generally, a still photographer is just interested in a compact, high quality lens. With cinema lenses, you want similar sized lenses because they're often being mounted onto a variety of devices, whether it's a Steadicam, a cage, a drone, or something like that. And you want to switch from a 50 to a 35 to a 24 millimeter lens. You don't want to have to rebalance everything. You don't want to need a completely different set of filters because it's a completely different shaped lens. And so similarity is very important in the cinema world. Still photographers just want to focus as quickly as possible to take the next shot, but cinema, they're much more interested in a smooth manual focus so that you can focus at just the right speed and at the right rate as well. Still lenses are looking to focus once again as quickly as possible, so the focus throw, so the distance from infinity to minimum focus, is a relatively short distance. Because cinema lenses are manual focus and they're often typically or many times being turned by hand, it's a very long focus though, so you can be very precise about where you are focusing. Now, still lenses will sometimes have what's called focus breathing, and that is when you change focus, there is a magnification change. So it looks like you're zooming in a little bit when you're changing focus, and that can be distracting when you're recording video. And so there's usually minimal breathing in those cinema lenses. The digital display in the viewfinder will show you where you're focusing on the new modern RF still lenses, but there's nice markings on the side of the cinema lenses, so the person who's in charge of pulling focus on a cinema lens, who's usually sitting to the side of it, not hovering above it, can see where they are focusing. The f-stops are a little bit more of a theoretical, how much light is going to come through a particular lens. T-stop is more of a technical, actual amount of light. And that's because in cinema, you often have multiple cameras shooting the same scene at the same time. And it's really important that they're all capturing the same amount of light so that it looks the same between them. With individual photographers, if somebody's capturing 5% more light or 5% less light, it's not as big of a deal. And so it's more theoretical on the still side, but actual on the cinema side. Still photographers work with third stops. That's probably as accurate as we need to get for a still image. But once again, because of multiple camera shoots, they need to be a little bit more precise in the cinema world, so they have a stepless aperture so they can match camera to camera a little bit more easily. And also, if they are changing from a light to a dark area and they need to change the aperture setting, they have a very smooth aperture control so that you can go from one setting to another control how much light is coming in the lens and really control the exposure during that shot. We just don't have that need in still photography. We have zoom lenses, but with the cinema world, they frequently have parafocal lenses, which is just a technical way of saying that when they zoom the lens, the focus point stays the same. For the still photographer, we'll zoom, but then we'll generally readjust focus once we zoom in or zoom out. At least that's the practice that I'm going to teach you, and tell you that is important in this class, is that you want to focus after you have zoomed. We have manual zooms in still photography. We're usually handling the camera ourselves and we can zoom in and out. We don't need a motor to do it. But when you're recording video, nobody can smoothly zoom with their hand as well as a motor can do it. And so there's a lot of motorized zooms that you can add on to lenses that make them better for shooting video. We like to have a product that's comfortable in the hand. It's got rubberized grips. And a lot of these other devices are being put on other mechanical devices to adjust the focus or aperture or the zooming of it. And so there's gears on there so that they can more easily adapt to these other devices. And so you can see that there's a very different world of cinema lenses versus still lenses. And in this class, we're done talking about the cinema lenses, as interesting as they are. All right, so the terminology is a very important factor when it comes to lenses. There are lots and lots of terms, and boy, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of those meetings at Canon, whether that new developer who came up with a new thing about lenses, they do this new thing, does he get a letter that gets put on the outside of the lens? I think that's a real hallmark of a very, very special feature, because there's a lot of things that lenses do, and they talk about them in some of the promotional information, but the letters don't make it onto the outside of the lens. The ones that are really important that they want you to know about are ones that they have listed as part of the naming structure of the lens itself. So there's a lot of acronyms that are thrown around when it comes to the world of lens technology. And in this class, I will, of course, be going through each and every one of these to explain what it is and how it affects your photos. Now, in some cases, this is not going to make you a better photographer in and of itself, understanding what ASC is in a lens. But I think if you're going to be a master craftsman, you should understand the tools that you're working with. You should understand what goes into them and what they're doing, so that you can make the best decisions when you're creating the work that you do with those products. And so we're going to go through all of these in the various different sections of the class, and you can see what sections of the class you'll be able to find information about each of these different pieces of technology. All right, so as we go through this class, I am going to be talking about RF lenses as well as RFS lenses. And this is something that has changed a little bit from the days of EF lenses and EFS lenses, which kind of followed the same pattern, but in the days of digital SLR. Back in the EF days, we had a lot more people that were shooting crop frame sensors, and so there was a lot more lenses that are available. Now, most lenses, most cameras that Canon makes are in the full frame RF lenses. And we're going to have those typically listed on the left side of the screen, and we're going to have the RFS ones listed on the right side of the screen. So as you see me listing them, that's generally the way that you're going to see the reference. So if you do have RFS equipment, just look to the right of the screen for information about your particular lenses. So now at the time that this class is recorded, you can see the number of RF lenses that have been made versus RFS, and you can see that they are heavily focused on making full frame lenses, and they're only making a token few lenses in that smaller APS-C 1.6 crop frame factor. And this is something that they're going to add to over the years, I'm sure, on both categories and in all the columns and all the rows, but you can see that they are really focused on the full frame system. A big aspect about choosing a particular lens is, of course, choosing the different focal length. We have 50 millimeters, which is traditionally seen as the normal lens. We have a lot of different wide angle choices all the way down to 10 millimeters. We have a number of great telephoto choices all the way up to 1200 millimeters, which is much longer than most people will ever need, but it's one of those tools that is nice to have out there. So these are what the angles of view you will see with the variety of focal lengths with the full frame lenses. If you would like to get that same angle of view with a crop frame sensor, the RFS system, you're going to need a slightly different focal length because the image sensor is smaller. Once again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in some of the technology sections in here. And so we're going to be going through all these lenses and talking about the various aspects of them. Sometimes I need to use words rather than numbers, and so we'll just talk about wide angle, normal, telephoto lenses, and I can even give them more specific names to really single out one angle of view that you might get, and it doesn't really matter what system you have, these are the types of lenses that we're going to be talking about in here. Now, if you would like a guide to figure out, well, which lens fits in which category, you can look in the class notes PDF for this guide here, which I've broken down the various different popular systems that are being used on the marketplace today and which lenses would fit into the different categories. One of the things, of course, that I've wanted to do in preparation for this class is to shoot a lot of sample photos to show you what different focal lengths look like and the reason for them. So this first collection here, I just want to show you here in the introduction section, is from the Galapagos Islands. We're starting with an ultra-wide 16mm lens, which shows you a lot of foreground and a lot from side to side. We're going to step our way through the focal lengths, going to all the major, most popular focal lengths as we zoom in now into the telephoto range. And in some of these, I've had to crop to simulate how close we're getting on some of these final ones to show you how close you can get in with one of these very telephoto lenses. And so let's go ahead and step back to a normal lens and back all the way down to a wide angle lens. So just a first quick reference of what you can see with the different range of lenses that are available. Now, I do make a little bit of a disclaimer here, is that I'm using a variety of cameras and lenses to take these examples. I am trying to keep them all authentic and true as possible, but I have rounded some numbers for simplicity. If I had a zoom lens and I had it set to 25mm, I might use that as a 24mm example. I know I might be bending the rules ever so slightly, but I'm trying to stay in the mode of education. Does this explain a good point about it? Is it truthful to what the nature of the particular lens does? That's what's important to me. Whether it's exactly the right number, not so important to me. Another obvious fact, there will be new lenses that will be introduced after this class comes out. Over the last roughly 80 years or so, Canon has introduced anywhere from 3 to 8 lenses every single year. And so I know new lenses are going to come out. And I am not going to remake this class because they came out with one new lens. Now, if there's something that really changes the whole ball game, well, I might have to revisit my thoughts and come back and record a new class or a new section or do something else. But it's the information that's important, not the specific lens in this class. I want to give you an education of how to understand and choose and use lenses. And the information in this class, I believe, should give you the information to understand and make smart decisions about any new lens that comes down the pike. Because this is basically a compilation of everything that I've learned about lenses over the decades that I've been dedicating my life to photography. So let me give you a little bit more detailed view of what we're going to be doing in this class. The next section on focal length, number 2, is we're going to be going through all the focal lengths, and we're going to be talking about some basic things for new photographers, about wide angle lenses and telephoto lenses, but I also have a couple of in-depth sections kind of snuck into the middle of it in there for the more advanced photographers wanting to look at perspective distortion and the compression effect that you get on wide angle and telephoto lenses and how that affects some of your images and how you can use that as a real tool. And we'll do a little bit of comparison between some of the different focal lengths and what it looks like in some different scenarios. So you should end up at the end of this section having a real good idea of what sort of focal lengths you need to achieve what you want to do in photography. Our next one, kind of also in the basic category of the aperture. Yes, there's going to be some basic information in here, but also in here are some more in-depth sections on hyperfocal distance and how to get the most out of your lenses in setting their aperture for sharpness, and how to get the most out of any particular lens, whether it be a wide angle or a telephoto lens. We're going to spend some time with really Canon-specific ideas and concepts. This first section, technology, is going to go through a lot of the different acronyms that you see. We're going to talk about all the different things that they are doing with lenses to correct for certain problems, what sort of problems to look for, what sort of technology can solve those different problems. And so this is maybe the nerdiest section of the class. I think it's kind of a fun one to go through, though. Next up are the features, and this is the practical hands-on application of a lot of the Canon technology that we were talking about in the previous section. And so in here, you're going to see a lot of the buttons and dials that you see on lenses to figure out exactly how they work, what they're for, and how to make the most of them. And then we're going to start getting into the lenses themselves. We're going to be doing a rundown of each and every lens that is currently available in the system, talking a little bit about who it's for, what's its main benefit, what are some things to watch out for, and then we're going to be doing some comparisons, some head-to-head comparisons. You know, a lot of people want to compare, well, what's a 2470 2.8 versus a 24-105 f4? Who would buy which one? Which one's the better lens? And that's the type of thing we're going to do in here, is do some really detailed comparisons to really showcase which lens is better for different types of purposes. And then we're going to go through the same process with the prime lenses. There's a lot of different prime lenses as well as zoom lenses. There's a lot of different reasons why you would want a prime over a zoom, and we're going to be talking about it in here, as well as the firmware that is involved in keeping your lenses performing at their very best. And so we'll address that in here. Now, the RFS lenses, well, we can fit all the primes and zooms in here because, well, frankly, there's not as many to talk about. So this is going to be a shorter section, but it's only because there's just not a lot of products in there. When it comes to macro photography, well, there's a whole lot of other topics in here. So I've saved one lens here. Well, actually, there's more than one lens to talk about in here. I've saved any of the lenses that have good macro capabilities to really talk about in here, because there's some special close-up focusing issues that we need to discuss, and we're going to do that all here in section 9. Now, I know the class is called the RF-mount, Complete Lens Guide, but we're going to talk about EF lenses as well. I've been using those for decades, and there's a lot of great lenses that you can adapt to your RF-mount camera. And so I want to take you through a little bit of the history of the EF lenses. We're not going to talk about every lens that they made, but we are going to talk about the latest and greatest and most important EF lenses that you might want to know about for adapting, because who knows, they may not make an RF lens in that category right now, or maybe forever. And so there's some good options there. We're also going to look at aftermarket lenses, non-Canon branded lenses. There are a limited collection at this time of other manufacturers that make lenses for Canon or that can be adapted to Canon. And there's a number of implications if you do want to do this. So you're going to want to see this if you want to adapt other mounts of lenses onto an RF camera. And then we're going to talk about accessories. We haven't had a chance to talk about this yet. So we'll be talking about filters and hoods and tripod mounts and telephoto accessories like extension tubes and teleconverters. And so there's a lot of other things that you can use with your lenses, and we'll talk about how they can help you out in this section. And then finally, I have a section called Building a System. And this is going to be good for helping you figure out what route do you go in which lenses are next on your list. What's a good system going to look like? I give specific recommendations for different types of genres. If you're doing sports photography or portrait, here are the prime lenses at different price points and how they will excel in different ways. I talk about groups of lenses. If you travel in a particular style or you have a certain agenda, what lenses would be good and why would they fit into a nice system? There's an infinite number of combinations, it would seem like, with all the different lenses that are available. You want to get one that's matched to your particular needs. And so that is what this class is going to contain. Hopefully you can see that we have got lots of great material to get to in here. I hope that I see you in the next section, because we're going to have a good time and learn a lot about lenses.